Hi guys, today we are going to tell you this, not the story of a battle, not the story of a heroic last stand, but the story of how the greatest invasion fleet Europe had ever seen was broken without ever conquering its enemy, not by cannons, not by generals, but by the sea itself. In the year 1588, the most powerful empire on earth believed it was unstoppable. Spain ruled oceans, continents, and trade routes. Its gold flowed from the Americas. Its armies dominated Europe. Its king, Philip II, was certain that history itself was on his side. So when England stood in Spain's way, small, defiant Protestant, Philip decided it would be erased. The plan was simple. Gather an armada so vast that resistance would be impossible. Sail it into the English Channel, land a professional army, end England's independence forever. On paper, it was flawless. In reality, it depended on one thing Spain could never control: the weather. By late spring, rumors spread across Europe of something never seen before. Shipbuilders worked day and night. Harbors overflowed with timber, sails, cannons, and men. Priests blessed hulls. Officers sharpened swords. Sailors whispered prayers they hoped they wouldn't need. By summer, more than 100 ships gathered under a single banner, massive galleons, supply ships, troop transports, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors. Together they formed what history would remember as the Spanish Armada. This was not just a navy, it was an empire in motion. Every ship was heavy with men, every deck crowded with weapons. Spain expected close combat, boarding actions, hand-to-hand fighting, decisive victory. The ships were built tall and strong, meant to intimidate and overpower, but strength came at a cost. These vessels were slow, difficult to maneuver, vulnerable in bad weather. And they carried supplies meant to last weeks, not months. Spain's entire plan relied on speed, coordination, and calm seas. None of those things would survive the journey. As the Armada finally set sail, the mood was confident, even triumphant. Many aboard believed England would fall without a fight. Some believed God himself guided the fleet. After all, how could such power fail? Yet from the very beginning, the sea pushed back. Winds shifted unpredictably. Ships struggled to stay in formation. Minor storms damaged rigging and forced repairs. Already the Armada was behind schedule. Already the margin for error was shrinking. Still the fleet pressed on. When the Armada reached the English Channel, it found the English Navy waiting. Smaller ships, faster ships, ships built not for boarding but for movement and range. The English harassed the Armada relentlessly, firing from a distance, refusing to engage directly. But this was not the disaster. Despite the attacks, the Armada remained largely intact. Spain still had its ships, still had its men, still had hope. What followed next would decide everything. Forced away from safe harbors and denied the chance to regroup, the Armada drifted north. The plan to link up with Spanish ground forces collapsed. Communication failed, supplies dwindled, fatigue spread. And then the winds changed. Off the coasts of Scotland and Ireland, the sea turned violent. Storms rose without warning, towering waves, screaming winds, relentless rain. Anchors snapped, ships collided. Navigation became guesswork in total darkness. One by one, vessels were driven onto jagged rocks, hulls split open. Men were thrown into freezing water, weighed down by armor, weapons, and fear. Entire crews vanished in minutes. There was no enemy to fight, no formation to hold, no command that could restore order. The Armada did not fall in a single moment. It disintegrated slowly, helplessly, ship by ship. Survivors who reached land found no safety. Many were captured, many were executed, many died from hunger, exposure, or wounds sustained at sea. By the time the remnants of the fleet limped home, the truth was undeniable. The greatest invasion force ever assembled had been destroyed not by England's navy, but by overconfidence, poor planning, and one unstoppable storm. And this was only the beginning of the story. Because the real consequences of this disaster would reshape Europe, redefine power, and change how nations understood war forever. The story did not begin with storms and wreckage. It began years earlier in council chambers far from the sea, where certainty felt safer than waves. Spain did not rush toward this invasion. It reasoned its way into it. By the 1580s, Spain stood at the height of its power. Its empire stretched across oceans. Silver from the Americas funded armies that crushed rebellion after rebellion. To many in Europe, Spanish dominance felt permanent, like geography rather than politics. England, by contrast, looked like an irritation, smaller, poorer, defiant, Protestant, but irritation had a way of turning into threat. English privateers attacked Spanish treasure fleets. English money and weapons flowed to rebels in the Netherlands. English ideology challenged Spain's authority not just politically, but spiritually. To King Philip II, England was not merely an enemy state, it was a heretical infection, and infections once identified were meant to be removed. Philip was not reckless, he was methodical, cautious, deeply religious. He believed that if something was done correctly, patiently, and with God's approval, it would succeed. Failure to him was not proof of a bad plan, it was proof of insufficient faith or incomplete preparation. So when advisors urged decisive action against England, Philip listened. The solution, they said, was overwhelming force, not a raid, not a warning, a complete and final invasion. The idea was simple in theory. Spain would assemble a massive fleet, the Spanish Armada, sail it into the English Channel, protect a crossing army from the Spanish Netherlands, land those troops in England, and march on London. England would collapse under professional soldiers before it could organize resistance. Every step made sense on paper, but the paper assumed a world that did not exist. The first problem was geography. Spain's invasion force was split across hundreds of miles. The fleet would sail from Iberia. The army waited in the Netherlands. Communication between them depended on messengers, signals, and timing that had no room for delay. The second problem was the ships. Spain's navy had been built for dominance, not flexibility. These were tall, heavy vessels designed to intimidate enemies and overwhelm them through boarding actions. They carried soldiers more than sailors. Cannons existed to soften targets, not to decide battles. England's ships, by contrast, were lighter, faster, and designed to fight at a distance. They relied on maneuverability and long-range fire. Spain knew this, and Spain ignored it, because Spain did not expect a prolonged naval fight. The Armada's job was not to defeat the English navy, only to survive long enough to deliver an army. Once Spanish soldiers were ashore, naval differences would no longer matter. This assumption became the invasion's foundation, and its fatal weakness. Planning continued for years. Ships were gathered from across the empire. Supplies were calculated with mathematical precision. Weapons were stockpiled. Commanders were selected not for creativity, but for obedience. Even the choice of leadership reflected Spain's mindset. The Armada's commander was not a seasoned naval genius. He was a nobleman, loyal, brave, deeply committed, but with limited experience commanding fleets at sea. Philip valued trust and piety over adaptability. This was not an army prepared to improvise. It was an army designed to execute a script. As preparations dragged on, problems multiplied, costs exploded, food spoiled, ships deteriorated while waiting in port, disease spread among crews, storms damaged vessels before they even sailed. Each delay made the plan more fragile, but instead of reconsidering, Spain doubled down. To stop now would be to admit doubt. To delay further would suggest God's will was uncertain, so the Armada sailed. From the moment it left port, the sea began to expose the plan's weaknesses. Winds scattered ships, coordination faltered, repairs became constant, supply calculations proved optimistic. Still, discipline held, the fleet regrouped, order was restored. Spain interpreted survival as validation. Then came contact with the English. The English navy did not rush forward, it stalked, it harassed, it attacked from range, then withdrew. Spanish crews struggled to respond. Their ships turned slowly. Their guns were harder to reload. Every engagement drained ammunition and morale. Yet again, this was survivable. The Armada remained mostly intact. Losses were limited. Spain still believed the real battle had not yet begun, but time was slipping away. The invasion depended on precise coordination with the army in the Netherlands. Each day of delay weakened that connection. Messages failed to arrive. Rendezvous points were missed. Supplies dwindled. And then came the fire ships. One night, English vessels packed with flammable material drifted toward the anchored Armada. Flames lit the darkness. Panic spread. Spanish captains cut anchor cables to escape, scattering the fleet. The damage was not physical, it was organizational. The Armada lost cohesion, ships regrouped but not perfectly, formation weakened, the English pressed harder, and crucially the Armada was forced north, away from friendly ports and toward open ocean. This was the turning point. Spain had lost control of where the invasion would happen, or if it would happen at all. With no safe harbor and no clear communication with the waiting army, the Armada faced an impossible choice. Return the way it came, risking pursuit and exhaustion, or continue north around Scotland and Ireland, trusting the Atlantic to allow passage home. They chose the sea. It was late summer. The Atlantic does not forgive optimism. As the fleet moved north, conditions worsened, winds strengthened, waves grew tall. Navigation became unreliable. Spanish pilots were unfamiliar with these waters. Maps were incomplete. Coastlines were deadly. Ships that had survived battle now faced something far worse. Storm after storm struck with relentless force. Anchors failed, masts snapped, hulls leaked. Exhausted crews struggled to make repairs while fighting hunger and sickness. Discipline began to collapse. Men prayed, men screamed, men threw cargo overboard in desperate attempts to stay afloat. Ships drifted apart. Signals vanished in rain and darkness. Commanders could no longer command. When vessels struck land, the impact was final. Wood shattered against stone, waves crushed decks, men drowned within sight of shore. Those who survived the wrecks found themselves in hostile territory, wounded, starving, and hunted. Local forces captured many. Others were killed outright. Few ever returned home. Weeks later, the remnants of the Armada staggered back to Spain. Less than half of the fleet survived. Tens of thousands were gone. The loss was not just material, it was psychological. Spain had believed itself invincible. Now it had proof that it was not. England, meanwhile, told a different story. Victory sermons praised divine intervention. Coins were minted, paintings depicted triumph. The storm was framed as proof that God favored England's cause. In truth, England had been lucky, but luck reshapes history as powerfully as intention. Spain would fight on, it would remain strong. But something fundamental had changed. The aura of inevitability was broken. Rivals took note. Rebellion seemed possible again, and warfare itself began to evolve. Naval combat shifted away from boarding and toward gunnery. Speed and maneuverability mattered more than mass. Control of the sea, not just possession of ships, became the new standard. All of this traced back to one decision: to trust that the sea would behave. After the storms finally loosened their grip, after the screams were swallowed by wind and water, after the last shattered hull disappeared beneath the Atlantic, something far quieter followed. Silence. It spread across the coasts of Ireland and Scotland, across Spanish ports waiting for ships that would never return, across the courts of Europe where certainty had once ruled. The disaster was over, but the consequences were just beginning. For the men who survived the wrecks, survival itself became a new kind of punishment. Those who washed ashore were no longer sailors of the world's greatest empire. They were soaked, wounded strangers in foreign lands, carrying no supplies, no protection, and no allies. Many were injured from rocks and debris. Others were sick from weeks of spoiled food and contaminated water. Almost all were exhausted beyond reason. They had escaped the sea. They had not escaped danger. In Ireland, fear ruled the coastline. English authorities knew Spanish soldiers were landing not as an organized invasion but as scattered survivors. Orders were brutal and simple. Any Spaniard found was to be captured or killed. Mercy was considered a risk. Some local Irish clans helped the survivors, hiding them, feeding them, guiding them inland. Others betrayed them for reward or protection. The Spanish sailors had no way to know which village meant safety and which meant death. Men who had crossed oceans now begged for bread. Many were executed on the beaches where they landed. Others were marched inland and killed without trial. Some died slowly from hunger and disease, hiding in forests and ruins, waiting for rescue that would never come. A handful made it home months later, gaunt, broken, haunted. They carried stories Spain was not ready to hear. Back in Spain, the return of the Armada was not celebrated, it was endured. Ships limped into port one by one, their hulls scarred, their crews decimated. Harbors that had once overflowed with confidence now echoed with grief. Families gathered, searching faces, counting survivors, realizing who was missing. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of sailors dead, ships lost beyond replacement, supplies gone. money spent that could never be recovered, but perhaps the greatest loss was invisible. Spain had lost its certainty. King Philip II received the news in silence. There was no public outburst, no dramatic collapse. Instead, there was resignation framed carefully as faith. He is said to have remarked that he had sent the fleet to fight men, not storms. The implication was clear. This was not failure. This was God's will, but belief could not repair ships. Faith could not refill coffers, and prayers could not restore the aura Spain had carried for generations. Across Europe, rivals watched closely. The myth of Spanish invincibility had cracked. England, meanwhile, told a very different story. In London, bells rang. Sermons were delivered praising divine protection. Medals were struck bearing inscriptions that credited God and wind rather than strategy or steel. Paintings immortalized victory. The narrative hardened quickly. England had been chosen. In truth, England had survived by a narrow margin. Its resources were strained, its defenses imperfect. Had the Spanish army landed, the outcome might have been very different. But history does not reward hypotheticals, it rewards results. And the result was this: England stood, Spain retreated, and Europe adjusted its expectations. Naval warfare changed almost immediately. The Armada exposed a truth that could no longer be ignored. Size alone did not guarantee control of the sea. Heavy ships packed with soldiers were vulnerable. Boarding actions were risky. Flexibility, speed, and long-range fire mattered more than mass. The English approach, lighter ships, rapid movement, sustained cannon fire, proved more adaptable to real conditions. Other nations took note. Ship design evolved. Naval doctrine shifted. Control of sea lanes became more important than single decisive engagements. The age of modern naval warfare was beginning, born not from triumph but from catastrophe. Politically, the impact rippled outward. Spain remained powerful, but it was now cautious. Resources were redirected. Future invasions were planned more carefully or abandoned altogether. Rebellions that once seemed hopeless gained confidence. Rivals pressed harder. The psychological balance of power in Europe had changed. Empires were still mighty, but they were no longer untouchable. And beneath all of it lay a lesson few rulers truly learned. Nature was not neutral. The sea was not a road. The wind was not an ally. The weather did not respect strategy. The Armada failed not because it lacked strength, but because it assumed control where none existed. Spain believed planning could replace adaptability. That faith could override uncertainty. That size could overcome chance. The storm proved otherwise. Centuries later, historians would debate details. They would argue over numbers, over tactics, over leadership decisions. But none of that erased the central truth. The Armada was not defeated in a single moment. It was undone by accumulation of delays, assumptions, rigid thinking, and overconfidence. The storm was merely the final judge. Long after the wreckage disappeared beneath the waves, long after the beaches were cleared of bodies and broken timbers, another battle began, a quieter one, fought not with ships or storms, but with memory. Because disasters do not end when they are over. They end when people agree on what they meant. And what the destruction of the Spanish Armada meant would shape how generations understood power, faith, and failure. In Spain, the official story formed quickly. The Armada had not been defeated, it had been tested. The storms were described as acts of God, mysterious, unavoidable, beyond human responsibility. Commanders were protected from blame. The king's judgment remained unquestioned. The plan itself was never publicly condemned. Spain could not afford that kind of honesty. To admit that the invasion failed because of human decisions would have been far more dangerous than admitting defeat by nature. Nature could not rebel, nature could not criticize, nature could not inspire rivals. So Spain mourned quietly and moved on, or at least it tried to. Privately, officials knew the truth was more complicated. Spain's treasury was strained to the breaking point. Replacing lost ships took years. Training new sailors took longer, and many of the most experienced men were gone forever. The empire still looked powerful, but it now felt brittle. In England, myth-making moved in the opposite direction. What had been a narrow survival became a glorious triumph. Paintings exaggerated victories, stories minimized fear. English naval commanders were elevated to near legendary status. The storms were rebranded as proof of divine favor. The phrase, "God blew and they were scattered," spread like gospel. This story was comforting, it was empowering, and it was incomplete. England had not destroyed the Armada. England had survived it, but survival was enough. It gave England something it had never truly possessed before: confidence. Confidence that it could resist stronger powers. Confidence that the sea could be its shield rather than its weakness. That confidence mattered more than ships or cannons. Across Europe, other rulers watched and learned. They saw that Spain's dominance was not absolute. They saw that naval power required more than size. They saw that logistics, weather, and flexibility could decide outcomes as decisively as armies. Slowly, cautiously, the balance of power began to shift. But perhaps the most important lessons were learned by those who never held crowns at all. Sailors remembered. They remembered ships that could not turn fast enough. They remembered overloaded decks and spoiled food. They remembered orders that could not be questioned even when circumstances changed. They remembered being told the plan was perfect right up until it collapsed, and these memories traveled. Naval warfare evolved not because kings changed their minds, but because sailors adapted. Shipbuilders experimented, captains trained crews differently. Navies began to value initiative instead of blind obedience. The Armada's failure became a reference point, a warning whispered rather than proclaimed. Do not trust the sea. Do not assume control. Do not confuse faith with certainty. Yet history is rarely so clean. Spain did not vanish. It continued to fight, to rule, to influence. England did not suddenly become dominant. It struggled, failed, nearly collapsed more than once. The Armada did not create a new world overnight, but it marked a moment when the old one began to feel unstable. Before 1588, empires believed power could be assembled, organized, and unleashed like a machine, that if enough resources were gathered, success was inevitable. After the Armada, inevitability felt fragile, because the sea had reminded everyone of something deeply uncomfortable. There are forces no empire can command. Storms do not recognize banners. Waves do not respect faith. Wind does not care who believes themselves chosen. The Spanish Armada was not destroyed because Spain was weak. It was destroyed because Spain believed strength was enough. And that belief, more than any storm, was what truly shattered the fleet. Every empire, no matter how powerful it appears, eventually encounters a moment when reality refuses to obey expectation. A moment when planning collides with chaos, when confidence meets consequence. For Spain, that moment came not in a throne room or on a battlefield, but on the open sea. The destruction of the Spanish Armada was not just a historical event. It was a warning, one that echoes far beyond the 16th century, because this story is not really about ships. It is not even about storms, it is about certainty. Spain believed it had done everything right. The fleet was enormous. The cause was justified. The preparations were extensive. The faith was absolute. From Spain's perspective, failure was not a possibility worth considering, and that belief shaped every decision. Plans were rigid because flexibility suggested doubt. Commanders were obedient because questioning implied weakness. Warnings were dismissed because acknowledging risk felt like disloyalty. The Armada sailed not just with weapons and soldiers, but with an assumption that the world would behave as expected. History punishes that assumption relentlessly. The sea did not care about Spain's dominance. The wind did not respect its faith. Geography did not adjust to its timetable. And when those forces asserted themselves, the Armada had no answers. This is why the storm mattered so much, not because storms are rare, but because they are inevitable. The true failure of the Armada was not that it encountered bad weather. Every sailor understood that risk. The failure was that the plan had no way to survive it. There was no margin for error, no alternative strategy, no space for adaptation. When the unexpected arrived, the system collapsed. And this pattern repeats itself again and again throughout history. Empires fall not when they face challenges, but when they convince themselves they no longer need to prepare for them. The Armada exposed something deeply human, the tendency to mistake confidence for control. Spain controlled resources, Spain controlled territory, Spain controlled armies, but it never controlled uncertainty. England, for all its celebration afterward, learned this lesson too, though it often forgot it later. Its survival in 1588 became part of its national identity. The sea was reimagined as a protective moat, a divine ally. That belief would someday lead England into its own moments of overconfidence. Because no nation is immune, the Armada's legacy is not that Spain fell and England rose. That is too simple, too neat. The real legacy is subtler and more uncomfortable. It is the reminder that power is fragile, that logistics matter more than ambition, that adaptability matters more than size, that nature remains undefeated. Centuries later, technology would change, ships would become steel. Navigation would become precise, communication would become instant, but the core truth would remain untouched. Wars are still lost to miscalculation, empires still fall to rigidity, and leaders still confuse belief with reality. The sea that shattered the Armada still exists. It has claimed countless fleets since, not because it is malicious, but because it is indifferent, and indifference is often more dangerous than hostility. When we look back at the Armada, it is tempting to search for villains, incompetent commanders, flawed kings, unlucky sailors. But history is rarely driven by single failures. It is driven by systems that refuse to bend. The Armada was a system designed to succeed under perfect conditions. The world rarely offers those. That is why this story endures. Because somewhere right now, another plan is being made with absolute confidence. Another leader is assuming control. Another system is being built without room for failure, and one day something unexpected will arrive. A storm, a disruption, a variable no one planned for, and history will repeat its lesson. The Spanish Armada did not fail because it lacked strength. It failed because it believed strength was enough, and that belief, more than wind or waves, is what truly destroyed it. If you enjoyed this story and want more deep, human, and honest history like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below and tell us what you think about the fate of the Armada, and most importantly, tell us where you're watching from. We read every comment and we're glad you're here.